everybody. Hello, hello, hello. I am a day late with Let's Get Live. I was traveling, so couldn't have done it yesterday. Tried to squeeze it in, but you know what? Airports aren't a good place to do these types of things. But anyway, today we are talking about tannin. So what is it? How does it get into the glass? And what does it do to our perception? And really, why do we perceive it that way? Okay. So before we actually get into tannin, I think it's important to know that what it is. So tannin is basically, in its most basic form, it's these compounds that bind together. And then when you're drinking it in the wine, they react with your mouth, okay? And it's important how they react with your mouth. And the kind of cool thing is everybody talks about tannins in red wines, but there is actually tannin in white wine also. And we're going to talk about why that is true, because where the tannins actually come from, okay? So now the amount of tannin in the wine itself comes from a variety of different things, right? So the grape variety itself is going to determine how much tannin there is. And you can kind of think of tannin as like sunscreen for the grape, right? So it's in the skins themselves. So different varieties have different thicknesses of skin, different colors of skin. So all of these things are going to impact how much tannin is in there. Tannin can also come from the vineyard, how the vineyard is managed, the vintage, right? Warm versus cool, all of these things are going to play an impact on the amount of tannin that ends up in that grape. And lastly, obviously, what the winemaker actually does to those wines in order, during that processing, in order to add or take away from the tannins. So let's look at what a tannin is. Okay, so this is actually the tannin structure. Okay, it is a flavonoid, okay, or non-flavonoid. These are two groups of tannins, and basically what happens is they come together and they are insoluble in water. So what happens is in our saliva, these compounds are not able to be broken down. So they actually kind of stick to our skin, stick to our palate, because it is unbreakable, or they can't be broken down with the water. So what you can think about them is kind of like burrs. You know, when you're walking through the forest or something, you get those little burrs on your socks or on your pants. That's kind of what a tannin is like. Okay, so they're insoluble in water. So what happens is they bind with the proteins in our saliva, and they get bigger and bigger. But then since it can't be broken down, they give us that drying sensation on our mouths, okay, or on our tongue and on our gums, okay? So we can get tannins from the grape skins, the seeds, the stem, and the oak. So within a grape, these are the parts of a grape berry. The outer skin has some tannin in it. Seeds have tannin in it. The stems have tannin in it. And then depending on how the winemaker produces the wine, oak barrels or barrels can add oak, or they can actually soften the oak depending on what's going on. So these are all things that go into the process of adding tannin to the wine. So the interesting thing is that how that winemaker is going to process the wine, right? If we do full cluster fermentation, now we're adding the we're adding the stems to that fermentation process. So that is going to increase the tannin structure. So if we're harvesting a grape variety that is big in tannin in the seeds, then the odds are we're probably not going to do a full cluster or whole cluster fermentation. Whereas if it's a lighter tannic grape variety, then maybe that is something we're going to do with it, that whole cluster fermentation, to kind of bulk up those tannins. So these are winemakers' decisions on what we're going to do. Now earlier I talked about that the tannins, the vintage can play a role in it. So, we have like cooler temperatures lend themselves to being higher in tannin, while warmer temperatures are going to actually have lesser tannins. So again, as the winemaker, we know what the vintage is like, and then we can adjust how we are going to process that fruit in order to get the end result that we are going to want. Let's see, what other pictures do I have? Okay, so now if you have an overly tannic wine, basically what you can do is you can aerate it. That's what those wonderful decanters are, and I did a whole Let's Get Live with about the decanters, so you can go back to that one. So the oxygen in there is actually going to kind of break down those tannins a bit for you. So if you aerate it, that can do it. But what a great way to counterbalance those massive tannins in a wine is by having fatty foods. So the fatty foods, the compounds in those fatty foods are going to break down those tannin compounds that we talked about earlier, and it makes for a wonderful pairing. And so that is a really kind of quick overview of tannins. Just what I want you to really take away from is that where the tannin comes from within that berry is the skin, the seeds, and the stems, okay? And that winemakers can process the fruit differently to help boost those tannic structures or to decrease those tannic structures. And remember, tannin itself is one of the primary factors of the ability to age those wines. So this is something that winemakers have in their mind while we are processing. And so I hope that helps tannin a little bit. And remember, I think it's so cool to think about it as those little compounds that come together and then create those burrs. And those burrs are what sticks to your gums to give you that drying sensation. Okay, so I hope this was entertaining to you. If you have any topics that you would like me to talk about, please leave it in the comments, and I will see you next week. Sláinte!